Hello, everyone. So, once again, welcome to another episode around the domain of rewards. And this time, we'll be discussing more around total rewards, the benefits, the definition, common pitfalls, how to achieve most effectiveness, and things like that. And today, we have David with us, who comes with over 2 decades of experience into building processes, building products around how do the total rewards communication becomes more effective, right? So David, why don't you give us a quick introduction about your journey so far, the types of roles that you've been a part of, and also more specifically, what are you up to right now? What are the types of things that you indulge in, and possibly what will be the best way for our viewers to reach out to you in case they have any doubts or in case they want to work with you? What would be the best way to reach out to you? So yeah, over to you, David.
Yeah, appreciate it. Hey, thanks a lot for inviting me. My career has spanned over a couple decades, as you mentioned, working for companies that were 50 people startups, all the way through Fortune companies of 350,000, public and private, global. Had the pleasure of working in 17 different countries, including India. And so I have a lot of experience in terms of all the kind of diversity and the different kinds of issues that different companies face in these different markets, different business environments. I think that, from my perspective, I'm co-founder of Integrated HR Partners, so we're a consulting firm in total rewards development. And total rewards is not a 50-year-old term. It's about a 10-year-old term. So defining it is probably the first step, and we'll get into that probably in a few minutes. But trying to figure out what companies, what compels their business, what is really going to be most effective for any given company is different for everybody, and the underpinning of that is the communication. So I'm really excited to talk about that. You can always reach me at dthompson at integratedhrpartners.com for some consulting around kind of the nuances of all this stuff. So, we can certainly help, and our firm really specializes in making sure that people understand the strategy and how all these different things that we're going to talk about here in a minute connect to drive success of an organization. So I look forward to the conversation here.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I leave the details in the comment section again, where people can directly reach out to you over the email that you mentioned. And interestingly, okay, yeah. So, firstly, before jumping into the nitty gritties of communication, pitfalls, and all of that, why don't you, David, first define that for us? What does total rewards exactly mean? And because you mentioned, interestingly, it is not that old term, right? It is just 10 years old, probably. What was it before that, right? How has this evolved from where it was, say, 10 years ago to where it is right now, plus where is this heading, right? So yeah, we can start with the definition of that first. What all does it include and things like those?
Yeah. Back probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you didn't hear the term total rewards. There was no such thing really.
True.
You heard about compensation and you heard about benefits. And I think some smart people sat around and said, well, those kind of seem to be connected. Those add value to an
Right.
employee. And in many cases, companies' bottom line was drastically affected by the costs of both of
Correct.
those. And so it became comp and benefits. And so you heard that term. And that took hold because it was logically made sense. And then, some smart people sat around again and said, well, hold on a second. There's other investments we make in employees. And, we reward them with a number of different things. So why wouldn't we connect all these things? And someone came up with total rewards. I don't know who it was. It certainly wasn't me. But at the end of the day, it made sense that it was a total package. And it started to be looked at as a comprehensive view of all the rewards that an employee could see uh, in the employment of an organization. And so within that, it started to expand. But as you might imagine, definitions became tough because the rewards is a pretty broad term. And so when
Correct.
people ask me, Dave, what is total rewards? Because there's still even a lot of business people that see that term and they don't quite know what it is. Many times I get total rewards. Isn't that the airline miles I get? That's a reward, right? And I say, well, it's not quite that, but it's similar to that in the sense that the single line that I use to explain it to people is anything that an employee sees value in. And people go, oh, okay. And that brings them a little closer to the definition or at least an understanding. And I would also say that someone would say, well, I'm sitting in this comfortable chair. My employer provided this chair and it's very comfortable. I see value in that. And I would say, well, there's some constraints around total rewards. I'm not in the furniture business, so but generally as a statement, I would say it's what employees see value in. And so that then becomes kind of four pillars. You have your compensation. Most people know what that is, but compensation is broad in context. So you have fixed pay, you have variable pay, you have sales incentive and executive comp, short-term incentive, long-term incentive, equity. Direct compensation is a pretty broad category in and of itself. The second pillar is benefits. Benefits can be defined in a lot of ways, but we typically think of benefits as kind of insured plans, as health benefits, as dental and vision and things like that. But I would say that things like retirement are included in benefits. There's a number of benefits that are defined contribution kind of plans that I would say are benefits. The third pillar, I would say, is development and recognition. And so people see a lot of value in development of their career and being recognized for hard work and success within that development path. And then the fourth pillar to me is work life integration. And that's really the management of people's self and their time and how much time they have off. Um, things like parental leave and vacation time and things of that nature, their environment, where they're working from, or is it remote or not. And those are the four pillars of total rewards by my definition. Now, as you get into different companies, they're going to be, I don't know, I'll say it this way, different definitions or different additions to what that value proposition happens to be. If you're in a multinational, as an example, relocation and immigration might be defined as a reward. And so you might see the expanding of the definition in one organization, or even a contraction in another organization, depending on what they're doing as a business, what their culture is, and things like that. So I've been fortunate enough to work for companies where I've had systems under me, meaning HR systems, immigration, uh, relocation, all these different kinds of things. And so the definition is something that when we come in as consultants, that's the very first thing we do. We ask, hey, let's sit down and make a definition of what total rewards means to your organization. And so then that gives us a baseline of how we can move forward in terms of progressing the vision and the mission of the particular organization in which we're working with. So the definition is a little bit, I don't want it to be a non-answer for you, but I would just say that it's a little bit nuanced in the sense that it depends on who you talk to and what things are important, either culturally or financially, for an organization. But those four pillars are basically the baseline definition of what total rewards would be for any organization.
Got it. Got it. So no, that's a very interesting definition, and I think summarizing that by saying whatever your employee finds value in, that is basically rewards, right? And four pillars. One was compensation. The other you talked about the benefits. The third you talked about development and recognition, and the fourth you talked about integration of work and personal life, right?
That's correct.
Correct. Wonderful. Wonderful. And since you mentioned it is what employees find as rewards, right? It might be different for different people. For example, you mentioned interestingly, uh, for a parent, it could be a paternity leave, maybe a maternity leave, right? But not all employees want to be parents, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one could be a pet parent, one could not be any parent, right? In such a scenario, how does an organization, without being biased or being favorable to a particular section of people, craft total rewards in a manner that it is not just inclusive of all, but also I would say neutral of all, right? Or let me put this differently. If I say I have a paternity policy in place, am I not being neutral at the first place? Or is it still neutral right now? Maybe 5 years down the line, that we won't find that as a policy because then it is not being neutral. Where do you see state of total rewards there? And we'll come to personalization a little later. But yeah, as far as catering to such a diverse workforce is concerned, how does one remain unbiased and neutral? How do we know that people are perceiving the same value out of total rewards that I'm planning for them at the first place? How would you go about, at your organization when you consult companies of varying sizes, right? How do you go about tackling this scenario where someone in the organization may want to have a certain type of benefit, but then how do you convince them probably to drop it, or the other way also?
Well, you've really hit the nail on the head with that question. We find ourselves in a multi-generational, multicultural workforce, and as you stated, and it's not true, everyone's needs and wants are different. And so I would say that there's a couple of ways I would kind of answer your question. The first way I would say is when I look at a workforce, there's kind of three groups that I place as an overlay. One is early career, one is middle career, and one is late career. Now, generally speaking, and survey data proves all this out. These aren't, Dave Thompson's made up things. Early career people typically want cash. They're not. They're usually more healthy. They don't think about retirement as much. The cash is king, kind of for that early career employee. Middle career people are starting to think a little bit more about having children, usually, or owning a home, or things of that nature, and they're a little bit more focused on benefits and things that are different than early career. And then your late career folks are typically, locked into retirement and time off and things like that. So just in terms of the demographics of your company, you can start to see these fissures, if you will, open up in terms of how you would offer different rewards across those multiple groups. Now, then you overlay the cultural component of that, and there's certainly different needs: parental care, paternity leave, pet insurance, things like that. And you come across to even a larger spectrum. So it starts to open up very wide in terms of what could be offered. And so one of the things that I always consult with my clients on is what's enough. Kind of what we can't have everything. It's not scalable. It's not cost
Correct.
effective. So what do we do? I would say one of those things is around your strategy, around your people strategy, and your total reward strategy of what your company demographics look like, what it looks like out over the horizon in terms of the evolution of your organization. And you start to focus on that. Back, I'll say maybe 10 years ago, you had a little bit more kind of brick and mortar total reward system. People weren't as remote. People were typically more in offices. And so you could do things like gym memberships and things that were very local to the community that people could take advantage of. Now we find ourselves in a far more remote work environment. So how do we deliver those same kind of rewards? And I use gym memberships from a health perspective because it's kind of an easy way to explain people's physical health. Well, we understood over time that a lot of people, their physical health isn't in a gym; it's out riding a bike, or it's rock climbing, or it's yoga, or whatever. So we started to understand that delivery became very important. And so when you start to look at that, I would answer your question this way: is to say you have to look first at your strategy and what you're really trying to drive. Look at your demographics and who you're hiring, how you're hiring them, what markets you're hiring out of, and you start to design that way. And are those the things that are going to be sustainable over time? And look, any strategy, any plan is always subject to change and most likely will, especially in today's business environment. And so you want to build in a real flexibility. And I think that's the real key here, is that flexibility within the platform and the design of that platform. So I don't know if there's a specific answer of kind of, what do you do as a particular organization? The word that I would say is most compelling here is competitive. So it's not so much that it's biased or unfair, but you have to be competitive. And so if you start to focus on any one thing or two things or 10 things, I think it behooves any organization to make sure that you remain competitive. And you can get that through market data and surveys and other things to understand what's really being offered out there and what people are gravitating to, again, with the overlay of your strategic plan, your demographics, kind of what markets you're in, what sectors you're hiring from. And that also plays into, inclusion and equity as well, and the diversity angle in terms of how you, operate and deliver those kinds of things. So, that's the kind of long answer. The short answer is there's not one size that fits all, and you need to be mindful. You need to bring in people who kind of understand how to scale that stuff. Integrated HR Partners is in depth at making sure that we first look at what those definitions are of total rewards, that we look at the strategic focus, what the culture looks like, because each company has their own culture. And if you kind of don't get this right, your culture can change out from underneath you without you ever knowing it, right? So you have to be very mindful of those things in the
Correct.
initial design elements.
Got it. Got it. And can you also walk us through a typical partnership with your organization? Let's say there's an organization that wants to work with you, right? What does the typical engagement look like? As in, is it time bound? That okay, it's a quarter of engagement where you'll start by looking at what their culture is right now, what their current system of rewards is. You'll look at the demographics and things like that, and then you'll come up with a strategy around that. Or is it more of a prolonged engagement wherein you would be there with the organization as their extended partner? Also, that brings me to another question. The culture of an organization also keeps on evolving, right? And how does total rewards evolve with that? Which means, would you be engaged with an organization throughout their life cycle in some form of the other, right? Because there might be your total rewards that grow, that I would say that go through a transition, right? An early stage organization, just say about 100 employees, might have a different philosophy of rewards today, right? When they grow to a 500 organization strength, let's say in 1 year's time, maybe it is different rewarding system that is needed versus an organization that grows from 500 to 1000 in the next 5 years, and then from 1000 to whatever, right? Maybe they sustain at 1000. Maybe a different reward philosophy is needed then. And this could not be with respect to, let's say, employee strength. It could be with respect to the maturity in the domain that they are in right now, right? So it may be pretty advanced organization with just 500 employees, and they'll forever be 500, maybe, right? uh, how does that bring about a change in the reward strategies of organizations, and how does your organization, when they engage with them, we can start with a typical mode of engagement, the duration, how do you help them, what does an engagement look like, and is there a certain maturity level needed before someone approaches you for that exercise, or it is pretty much everything, as in there would be companies of varying sizes and maturity that come to you, right? Even an organization that's 50 employees comes to you, and an organization which is 2 lakh employees would also come to you. So can you throw some light on a typical engagement that you do, and then, as I mentioned, different phases, how that matures and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our preferred platform is to get in as early as possible. Many organizations, as they start off, don't necessarily connect the dots, so to speak. They're not looking at Total Rewards as a platform. They look at it as, from a competitive lens, how do I need to hire people? And they start layering on things that are competitive within the market. And so that serves them well when they're small and they don't need to scale cost and resources. But what they get is a Frankenstein. If you're familiar with Frankenstein, it walks and it talks, but it's not really going to win the race for you.
Correct.
So I would just say that our engagement, we look
Correct.
for long-term engagements because companies do evolve. So as an example of that, you might have as you mentioned, a 50 or 100 person organization, and you put some benefits in place, and you put some things in place that were competitive, at least for your size, that you could afford. It all comes down to affordability usually, but it maybe isn't serving your future state. And so to look at that as early as possible makes it easier to either implement or design changes to the system that aren't really disruptive to the workforce. In other words, you don't have to rip things out and have a takeaway from your employees. You can evolve them and be transparent of, hey, we're growing an organization. Here's the things we can have today. Here's the things we would put in place in the future, et cetera. And then as that organization evolves, those changes and the change management of those things becomes a lot simpler because the employees are more informed and they understand the plan going forward. You have a lot of different
Correct.
market environments that change as well. And so you brought up maturity. And I think that's the key word to think about as your organization matures. What changes would be necessary to make sure that you stay relevant, that you stay market competitive? Are you going to go public or stay private is a huge decision. And a rewards platform needs to kind of flex to both of those paths, if you will, from the regulatory environment and other things. But what I would say is if you start to look at more of that long-term vision, and get in early, it makes things a lot easier as you mature as an organization. Typically, you'll see a startup organization many times doesn't have a lot of cash, but they have a lot of equity. So they'll put more things into the equity side because it doesn't have direct financial consequences immediately, and less cash. As revenues start to pick up, as they gain clients, they start to get more cash, and then they have people, maybe a board of directors, looking at the equity position and saying, "Well, hold on a minute, we're getting really diluted over here. So let's start to move cash up and equity
Correct.
down." And so those levers and dials that you turn to
Right.
mature the total rewards platform pay huge dividends in terms of the scalability as the organization matures. And again, the key word is maturity. If you look at
Correct.
how you attract talent in the markets, the talent markets that you're trying to gain talent from, and key contributors, you have to really pay attention to, again, what is competitive, but it has to also be aligned with the maturity of your company and what you can afford from an economics perspective. So your point in terms of how you would be within an organization and be with them over time, I think is critical to have someone like my firm in there in a long-term engagement. That doesn't mean that we need to be in your
Got
face
it.
every day, but we can be that critical resource that either maybe you can't afford, or you can't find people with the vision or the experience up front. And maybe you hire that team and build a team over time. But initially, to have our firm in there becomes that arm that you don't have probably within your organization until you reach a certain maturity, and able to anticipate those changes in organizational structure, different kinds of entities, etc. So I think the long-term engagement is best for us. But one thing I would say is sometimes people and organizations look, especially executive leadership, and say, this, I think there's just a small tweak that's needed. And sometimes that is the case. It's rare, but sometimes it's the case. But we're very data driven. So we can produce the data and say, hey, look, here's what the data is showing. Now, I think many times people get,
Right.
I'll say, you know, data focused, too focused. And even though the data shows one thing,
Got it.
that will inform your decisions, but it doesn't mean that 100% of the time you go a certain way because of the data. Sometimes you have to make decisions, or you want to make decisions that are a little bit counter to what the data is showing. And so you have to be open minded to say, hey,
Correct.
let's really think about what our strategy talks were, what our direction was going to be, what our mission and vision are, and then look at the data and say, okay, is that data showing a support of what we're doing, or is it going in the opposite direction? And then align those things. Now, once those are aligned and you start to do those implementations and design and implementations in that order, I would say that you would have to look at that and say, okay, well, from that perspective, do we have to make a tweak? And so that's where we would stand up and say, hey, we're here to help partner with, what those happen to be. Those changes happen to be. And again, it's organic. So as things evolve and as new data comes in, as the organization matures, there might be different decisions that need to be made.
Got it. No, no, that's absolutely right. And because this also so much context behind data. If that is not absorbed well, probably the data might lead you to wrong directions.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. So, okay, then the next thing that we want to touch upon with you, David, is around communication, right? Because it is one thing to have the best of all the worlds in your total rewards as components, and the other is around effective communication of that. You know, the employees are reminded of their compensation probably every time their salaries hit their accounts, right? But when it comes to total rewards, it doesn't really happen that way, right? It is not that frequent. It is not that on the face, right? So, can you throw some light on the best practices around effective communication? If you can talk a little around the frequency of communication, the mode of communication, and how are companies doing this as of now, right? They frame a very good rewards package with your help, but then how do they also communicate this to their employees so that they truly understand what it means?
Yeah. I think communications is the key to all this. I mean, you could have 1,000 programs out there that is perfectly designed, hits every demographic, is the most competitive in the world. But if people don't understand that it's even
Right.
there, where are you at? So I think communications is critical in the sense that um, if you go to as I discussed earlier, if you have someone that's late in career and you communicate with them and say, hey, we're standing up a parental leave program and it's the best in the world. And the person looks at that and says, I'm late in career. I'm not having any kids. I don't care what you do in that area. It's not in context, right? So from my perspective, when I
Right.
look at those, I look at kind of the pillars, if you will. What verbal communications do you have? What nonverbal communications do you have? What visuals are you providing? And then what are your written communications? So how can you kind of contextualize those and target those different audiences, if you will, so that it's relevant to them? There's a second part of it, which is to say, I
Correct.
think many employees, especially when you look at this from a global context, there's so many nuances of how rewards are presented to us as part of that employment agreement, if you will, that you have with an employer. And some of those don't come from the
Correct.
company. Sometimes they come statutorily from a government, let's say, if it's healthcare as an example, or whatever it happens to
Correct.
be. But that doesn't mean the company is not paying into that. There's still an investment that's made from the company to have even those
Absolutely.
types of rewards. So I would say, from a total rewards
Correct.
perspective, a communication perspective, you really want to customize exactly how you look at that. So the targeted audience is very important. The content that you put in front of employees is very important. And then ultimately, what are your intended outcomes of those communications? Do you want people just to know about it? Do you want people just to use it? Kind of what? And these are kind of the conversations you have from a strategy perspective at the front of an engagement to say, if we understand that our health costs are very high, and we can come to an understanding that wellness programs create a healthier workforce, which drives down the cost of healthcare, then that becomes a strategy in which we want to make sure our wellness programs are propped up in a way where they're effective. So the intended outcome would
Correct.
be make sure we have good wellness programs to drive down our costs of health insurance, as one
Healthcare
example.
costs.
And so you start to
Correct.
look at this and say, how do I get employees to engage in that? And how do I communicate that effectively to them? I think many times companies fall short, in my view, of what I see, which is they give one communication a year around total rewards. They do a total rewards statement, usually after the year end or right after bonuses or something like that. But again, it's not in context. It's a bunch of numbers on a sheet that people don't really understand. So I think there's a frequency of communication over a year that lead people in understanding what this total reward statement is going to say. And maybe you do one mid-year, maybe you do one quarterly, something like that, but get people to understand what the investment is that companies are making in their employees. It's
Correct.
very substantial in most cases. Sometimes you get people who come to the table and say to their supervisors or managers, hey, I'm not paid enough. You're not paying me market rate. Well, what do you mean? Oh, well, I talked to my friend across the street and they make more than I do and they do the same job. Well, what do you mean they make more than you? Well, you
Correct.
pay me a certain rate of fixed pay and they make a higher rate of fixed pay. Okay, but that's only one component of the investment we make in you. Versus if they understood that
Correct.
a total investment and someone came to them and said, hey, I make more than you do in the same job, they would understand that, well, okay, maybe you make more fixed pay than me, but I also have variable. Do you have that? Oh, you don't. Or I get 100% of my healthcare paid for. Do you get that? Oh, no, you don't. Oh, so there's value in these other
Correct.
components. It's not just about a pay rate. And so to get people to understand that
True.
starts to build this engagement. And is it supporting that work life integration? Are they developing in a way? Are they gaining the skills and knowledge to move in their career? Um, I think that communication piece from a context perspective becomes really important, but it's also how you deliver it. So for me, I work long hours. And so for me, I look at these kind of communications and communications people are making to me, usually late at night. I want kind of get to the point, give me like a 5-minute video and I'll watch it and I'll understand it. And that's fine. I do that, at midnight, let's say. Some people want a piece of
Correct.
paper, some people don't. And so it's kind of understanding too how you deliver those things, right? If someone is really busy all day and they're doing emails and they're in meetings and they're designing code and systems and all that, they might not have time to sit down and watch a video, or they might not have time to read a piece of paper. So I think the strategy of understanding your workforce, delivering in maybe multiple medias, keeping it in context and understanding what those intended outcomes would be, are probably the key to successful total rewards communication. So But you need to think about that at a time and design that, because all of those come with a cost and expense. And again, if you don't do it right, you start to get, in my view, potentially a reputation um, around things that you never intended had to have a reputation about. So you have to be careful of how the market sees you externally, how your incumbent base sees you,
Right.
and what you're really trying to achieve culturally, not just around what you offer, but how you communicate that, and how that transparency of communication is effective in a way to create that engagement amongst employees.
Absolutely, absolutely. And because it also talked about the frequency of communication, and as you mentioned, at times that might come at a cost. So I've came across companies who are trying, so they've engaged a third party who does total rewards statements for them in a very beautiful manner, right? So at times total rewards, as a statement or as a communication, comes at a cost, right? How do you decide the right frequency for that if it comes at a cost? Because then how do you measure the ROI, as in, uh, how much is enough, and how much is overdoing it, right? So is there a golden number that you propose, David, to your clients, that you work with, that hey, you know what, probably 3 times in a year communication is good enough, or 4 times in a year is good enough? uh, do you have some uh, magic numbers around
I
that?
don't have a magic number, but I would say 2 or 3 times probably isn't enough. But I say that in context, because if
Got
it's
it.
just a total
Okay.
reward statement coming, it's definitely not enough. This needs to be talked about at all hands meetings. This
Right.
needs to be in performance reviews and talked about at times where managers interact with their employees frequently. I think the frequency is key in terms of when it's talked about and how it's understood. One of the ways to measure that is surveying. You start to ask employees questions about how well do you know your benefits.
Right.
Your HR business partners are a key resource in making sure that you keep a pulse on the employee workforce of their understanding what kind of questions are coming into your queues that your total rewards team or benefits team or comp team needs to answer. And you can kind of get a sense of the knowledge change, right? Those questions start to slow down or disappear
Got it.
completely. So there's multiple ways to kind of understand if you're being effective in the communication. But another thing I think you have to be very careful about is total rewards typically is a function of HR. And with, I would say, a heavy dotted line to finance, but HR sends out a lot of communications. Fill out your time card, make sure you put your vacation in, whatever it happens to be. And so you get this river of things coming from HR, and many times the total reward
Right.
statement is just another email from HR. So I think it has to be highlighted
Right.
in a way that, hey, this is something you might want to look at. And that has to be, again,
Got
bolstered
it.
from the top down, in my view, from a frequency perspective of what those investments are. So I think it's a drumbeat that you don't want to kind of overplay that drumbeat, but you definitely want to have a heavy frequency until you understand that people do start to understand that. Now, that's the incumbent base. I think a lot of this can be circumvented in the hiring process as well. So as people come into the organization, you can really
True.
set the expectation of what they're getting, um, what those investments are, how they're going to be communicated with, and set the tone, if you will, of people coming into the organization of what the investment is. So there's kind of two groups I would look at: the
Correct.
incumbent base, and then how we actually attract talent, and then embed within each of those processes where those frequencies and context of communication come from. But I think it has to be a lot more than 1 or 2 or 3 times a year. In context to what you said, is it a total reward statement 1 or 2 or 3 times a year? Yes, maybe that, but it has to be much more than that. It has to be, again, articulated in verbal, in nonverbal, not just in writing, but in images. So, are you putting things on your internet that are showing people doing healthy lifestyles? Are you, like, how do you kind of resonate with your employee workforce, and how do all those different things connect? I think it has to be relatively frequent, and not just another email from HR. Because we all know, I think,
Got
that sometimes people don't look at every HR email, if I may be so bold to say that, because we get caught up in it, right?
No, that's correct. But help me understand. How does an HR team actually seek a budget for an engagement like this with your organization, right? So they know, okay, people spend already the largest, communication is, or having a good total rewards package probably is effective, right? But when today every spend is being scrutinized by the CFO office, how do they make a compelling use case of engaging with David and revamping their total reward strategy? As in, what is the change that they can objectively take back to the board? Or is it not objective at all? It is just a good thing to do. Eventually this will translate to some numbers, people being happier, employees are more happy with, satisfied with their compensation. Is there a very objective before and after that you do when you engage with clients, that okay, before engaging with us, a survey was done and the NPS with respect to compensation was 62%, right? And we'll measure the NPS post the revamp after a year, something like that. Is that something that they take back to the board, or this is something that the board usually understands? As in, how do you help the HR teams craft a compelling business case for an engagement like this?
I would say lean into the data first. But I want to address something you said a moment ago, which is let's do this because it just feels good. Real hard sell in the CFO's office. We want to definitely show an ROI, and I think there's a substantial ROI on
Correct.
how we do that. So there's costs involved that are in orbit of total rewards. So time of hire,
Right.
right? How long does it take us to actually hire someone? Turnover,
Got
things
it.
like that. There's real objective measurements in terms of what the
True.
effectiveness of your platform happens to be. And if you think about a platform, when I call it a total rewards platform, because I look at it as literally a platform. So it's like a stage. And that stage is built out where you can
Correct.
plug things. You can have a rock concert, or you can have an opera, or you can have a ballet, but they're all on the same stage. So that platform becomes key. And then moving those
Correct.
component parts of total rewards in and out based on your needs and how that data is reflecting your success becomes key. So, from a platform perspective, I look at it as what are we trying to measure? What are we trying to gain by this? Are we trying to get employees more engaged? Are we having issues with people taking time off because they're not healthy? Are we having issues with people not feeling their worth? They're not being recognized. They feel stagnant. Any of those
Got it.
things can all be measured. If it be in objective kind of financial
Correct.
numbers or in survey data returns, we start to look at, well, what are we really trying to do? And we built the business case around the data and what are we trying to affect? So if we're trying to
Got
affect
it.
turnover, as an example, and we're getting exit interviews that are saying, hey, you just don't pay me enough, we can very effectively start to figure out, okay, if we heighten pay, did we see a return there?
Correct.
So I think you lean into the data, but there's also, I would say, a nuance, if you will, and you brought that up, which is, does it just feel good? Sometimes, there's things that just feel right. That's a guttural feeling that says, hey, this is something we should do. I try and eliminate anything that's unmeasurable to put it into an objective category that is measurable. And you can usually do that if you have a really distinct path of what you're trying to achieve. So I would say the answer, in short, is to lean into the data, figure out the things that you think are most
Got
important to
it.
your organization, and then keep measuring those frequently. That's why I talk about the long-term engagement of my firm. We can keep measuring those and make
Correct.
sure that we're getting down the road in the direction we want. But again, best laid plans sometimes are faulty. So do we have to change the plan? Yeah, maybe that's the case too. But at the end of the day, measure your data, make sure that you're getting that return on investment of anything that you do, and show those benefits up front. Forecast what you think they're going to be. If they're not meeting the mark, then you have to, make some changes.
Got it. Got it. Fair point. And where do you see this heading, David? As of now, eventually all of this is to make your employees feel belonged, feel appreciated, feel rewarded. Of course, a sense of fair pay as well. But where are we with respect to letting employees personalize their total reward packages? I'm aware that Carta had this initiative where they let employees choose between two reward packages, one heavy on equity, the other heavy on maybe cash, right? Uh, so, do you see something of that sort playing around in the future where the employees are happiest when they get to choose between multiple options, or does that only get them more confused and they end up rejecting an offer? So what do you think has to be done with respect to personalization? Also, you can talk about some of the things around personalization. I think benefit space has gone some degree with respect to personalization, but do you also see that percolating to the cash, equity, long term, short term incentives, those spaces as well?
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I think I used the term flexibility earlier, and I think that is the key to things. Um, but equally, causing confusion is not a good thing. And doing things that are counter to the company's strategy or long term success have to be weighed out as well. So, as an
Hmm.
example of what you brought up, if you had a situation where you were to say to someone, hey, I'll give you more cash and less equity, or more equity and less cash, you choose. But your strategy is to create long term incentive for key individuals. You're really all of a sudden producing
Right.
something that has an unintended consequence, which is someone gets equity quickly or only a little bit. And so that long term hook, if you will, is not in place. And so you have to be a little bit careful around that.
True.
Secondly, it also does cause confusion many times in organizations, because when it comes down time for compensation review and those kinds of things, people look at market data. Organizations typically will say, hey, where is someone at relative to a market reference point that we've decided on? And if someone has been paid higher
Correct.
cash, they're higher within that market data, versus the person who chose
Correct.
lower. And so you see this inequity build where the person who chose the lower cash looks like they're under market.
Correct.
And so if you're not looking at those
Correct.
comprehensively and saying kind of what's the total value and where do they apply to market, then you'll see pay raises and things like that in places where they probably shouldn't be. So from a maturity perspective, you have to
Absolutely.
be really careful in terms of how mature is your organization to understand that and be able to articulate that in times when you have comp review or merit review or things like that. So that confusion becomes plays out in a very real way, if your organization isn't as mature as you would like it to be. And that goes back a little bit to turnover. As you bring new people into the organization, you have a heightened training effort to make sure they understand it. So you're really kind of
Correct.
increasing your costs to make sure that you can have this flexibility. So I would say, from my perspective, not many organizations are mature enough to handle something like direct compensation differences,
True.
but where I think most organizations could get some traction around that flexibility, and you mentioned it, is the lifestyle spending accounts. Hey, we want, instead of
Correct.
having this brick and mortar gym membership and these other things, we're just going to put money in an account for you, and here's the things you can
Correct.
use it on that are personal to you, versus we're going to spend it on your
Correct.
behalf and hope you use it. We're going to create some flexibility within that. So from the direct compensation perspective, I'm not sure that you want to put too much flexibility, because there's strategic motives behind
Absolutely.
that, of how you compensate people with variable pay, with short-term and long-term incentives. But from a personalized perspective, how you spend your money on wellness and other things, I think there's a way to do that in kind of a stipend, if you will, so people can
Correct.
use it in the way that they see fit. But still, the measurement of, is that being effective around the goals we have of either driving healthcare down, et cetera, and measuring those things and seeing even if that's working. But the flexibility, I think, is key.
Absolutely. No, no, very well said. In fact, this is one thing that again keeps coming up, that when once you offer flexibility of changing the cash versus equity portion, that I think there are too many complexities to it in itself. Uh, maintaining pay equity is a challenge in organizations. How do you tackle a scenario where you allow people to choose between components? So very well said. I think organizations systems have to mature to that level before any of this flexibility is given. But as far as the other benefits, wellness is concerned, I think learning is concerned, maybe we can allow more flexibility for employees to choose and be happier with their total rewards package overall. Absolutely, absolutely. So, David, as we are towards the end of this episode, I would want you to, also leave our audience with a thought around, let's say there's an organization which hasn't paid much heed to total rewards package as of now, right? Where do they start? How do they start bringing about that change? One is, of course, and which will make it easier for them, is to engage with you directly and do that exercise over a period of time and do all of that, right? But if someone were to start today, if they do not have the means to engage right now and they have to do something themselves, what would you suggest to such organizations right now?
I think the first step, the logical first step for any organization is to understand what investments you're making. I think it's that
Got it.
management, many times, um, and rightfully so, is running a business. They're developing code, they're selling a product, they're marketing, they're doing sales, they're doing all the things that they should be
Correct.
doing. And not
Correct.
necessarily paying attention or have the information at hand to look at total rewards
Correct.
as a driving force to the success of their organization. They're I think the to look at where all these investments are made, to be able to educate managers and people running the organization and what those pitfalls are, I think is a really relevant first step, so that you can get in
Got
line,
it.
you can get on the same page with executive management and executive leadership as to kind of where all these pitfalls are and where the spends are happening. I think the second step of that is to say, okay, from a strategy perspective, what do we do with the data that we have and the knowledge we now have? And some of these things will just come out. They'll be very obvious. Hey, we're having turnover in a certain group, or we have a lot of mothers and we don't have good parental leave, or whatever. Some things will be completely obvious.
Right.
And you can make those things, and you can then start to take the things that don't cost you quite as much. Leave, as an example, certainly has a cost, but it's far less than health benefits or other things that are just cash out of the bank account.
You're right.
You can start to take that, the term I don't like very much, the low hanging fruit, and start to kind of implement those things that don't have direct cash implications to your organization. So I think there's some logical steps. Understand what that investment is so you can articulate it to your management, train the management so they can articulate it to employees, and then start to look at where you can make those smaller tweaks without professional consultation, let's say, and see if that starts to work for you. Start to really use total rewards as the strategic advantage that it really is, and how you can kind of do that in a way that's not too invasive into the business, so people can still do their day job, quote unquote, but still also understand that some of these decisions they make in their hiring, some of the decisions they make in their performance management, some of the decisions they make in the things that they do every day really have an effect not only on the culture but the performance of an organization. So take those small micro steps first, look at the data, understand where the investments
Correct.
are, train your folks, all things any organization can do. Doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take a lot of money, and get into a place where you've taken that next step of maturity, because that's the very first step of maturity. Designing systems that
Correct.
all connect and all the nuanced things that we talked about can be really overwhelming to an organization. So don't try and take it all on at once. Take it in baby steps and just bite off small chunks and mature that organization to a point where you start to realize, okay, now we have full understanding. Now we know what the employees are thinking. Now we can see where our progress needs to be made. And then I would say engage a firm like mine or others if need be, hopefully mine, and start to make those longer term strategic decisions around scalability and profitability and cost reduction. But I think those first few steps are very simple, as long as that you put that as a priority in many priorities that executive leadership and boards have to deal with, each and every day.
Correct. No, that's very well put, David. Thank you so much for the insightful session. I think there's so much to learn from this. Uh, Also, for everyone else, I'll leave David's coordinates for you to reach out to him directly. I'll also share his LinkedIn profile. You can reach out to him there. So that's all for now from my side. Thank you so much, David, for being here and enlightening us on Total Rewards. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to discuss, and we'll maybe come out with one more episode with you around effective communication strategies of rewards, and maybe do a deep dive into the type of engagement that you do with
Yeah,
your
I'd be
customers.
honored. Thank you so much for having me, and such a great conversation. I look to more conversations in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much once again.